Next up, we have the Observe product overview with Erin.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about what is Observe, also known as the Observe product overview. Briefly, who am I? Erin Noe-Payne, Senior Development Manager here at Shopify. My Slack picture, which is how most people at Shopify know me. I'm the adult, not the child. I've been here 3 years, so about 6 months after Elijah. And in that time, my role has been essentially kind of the owner of Observe, especially as a user-facing product, as a UI. And when I started, Observe was pretty much an idea, a prototype of a Grafana instance with a data source that queried some trace data out of BigQuery. And it was not in production. And my 3 years has been pretty much a series of increasingly huge migrations. Essentially replacing our tracing vendor and Observe, basically becoming the place where Shopify goes to search and view traces. And then in the next year, replacing our metrics and monitoring vendor, which was a really big lift, so that Observe became the platform for metrics and monitoring. And then now we're kind of in the tail end of replacing our logging vendor. So Observe has now become the platform where Shopify goes to search and analyze their logs. And at this point, as Elijah was mentioning, it's really Shopify's all-in-one observability platform. So I've been up close and personal. And pretty much what I'm going to do is, look, what is Observe? For us on the observability team, I think this is kind of how we think about it, right? We've got all of this software that is Shopify, right, which is very many services, micro and monolithic, Ruby, a lot of Ruby, Go, TypeScript, some Java, right? A lot of languages. A bunch of third-party software and services, Nginx, MySQL, Cloudflare, Edge, that kind of stuff. And then from all of those services, we have to collect all of our observability signals, our metrics, logs, traces, and profiles. A ton of infra, so much infrastructure to collect all that data, bring it together, write it to storage, query APIs to query the data back out, and ultimately serve, first and foremost, the UI, the product, as well as a number of programmatic consumers, like our alerting system, obviously. There's some things like, I think our auto scalers, the HPAs for core, read out of our metric system, that kind of thing. So, for us, it's the whole system. But, I think if you walked around Shopify and just asked people what is Observe, right, what they're going to say, probably first and foremost, what you're going to hear is our web UI, observe.shopify.io, which is where they go to view their observability data, configure alert rules, that kind of thing. They might also mention like, oh yeah, it's the thing that pages me or alerts me on Slack when something's going wrong. They might also mention, code changes they've had to make with respect to one of these migrations. I think it's worth understanding these migrations are not simple lift and shift. It's a huge part of the migration process is data cleanup, like figuring out what we have, making the data better. What do we still need in terms of the instrumentation of the data, the dashboards, the alert rules? Like that work is something that's happened across Shopify. The observability team has had to lead that, give people guidance, but all of Shopify has really had to participate in the process of migrating and really taking ownership and improving the quality of our observability data. It's a big deal. This tool is a product and a platform built on data, and really ultimately it's only as good as the data. So that's a big part of it. And the other thing that probably a lot of people would mention is interacting with our support as embodied by, in particular, Ryan Woodworth and Jenna Black, our support ops team on Slack. Yes. Who do a ton of work to support our users and our operations, write our documentation. And what I'll say is, obviously these two people are really, it's like their full-time job, but ultimately I think our whole team has a real culture of support. I think everybody helps a lot with this, and it's a big part of what has made us successful. I mean, it's a necessary part of doing these kind of migrations. There's a lot of like hand-to-hand combat, as some people would call it. That's a little oppositional, but I mean, it's just a ton of like really getting up close and personal with all of our users, all the people at Shopify, and getting to solutions. How do we instrument this stuff well? How do we get useful, good quality, meaningful observability out of our systems? And so the way we do that is by support, by helping people in Slack, get on calls, write good documentation, and just get good working solutions for Shopify. Okay, so what is Observe as a product, right? The product piece is really what's external facing. Our users mostly don't care about our ingest pipelines or our databases. To them, it's the UI, the query APIs, how they're getting alerted and paged, how they're instrumenting, like we own a bunch of libraries or we own the guidance, docs, tutorials, and human support, humans helping people. Okay, so with that said, the main thing I'm gonna do is pretty much just show you Observe, right? I've just got a whole bunch of screenshots. And I'm pretty much just going to walk through the pages of the app. It's not the most glamorous. I'm really a live demo lover, but it was just there's so much here. It was like I can't do it in the time. I can't really walk through it in the time, and so I pretty much just have a bunch of screenshots, and I'm going to try and make it make sense. So here's the obvious place to start. This is Observe. This is kind of where you would land, and here's the side nav. So that's the parts of Observe, right? If you look at this, the obvious thing for many people would be, looks like Grafana, because it is. We've built on top of Grafana. But in particular, as Elijah mentioned, the main thing that we get out of Grafana, what we really leverage Grafana for, first of all, is just their dashboarding system, acting as a platform, like user management, data source management, sort of all of those table stakes, like web app type stuff. But then beyond that, and then just like their standards, basically data sources, data frames, and just a standardized way for querying any source of data, getting the data in, and then pushing it into pretty good quality configurable visualizations. That's what Grafana does for us. Well, it's been really great. But realistically, if I look at this and I'm like, what of this is Grafana? Explore, dashboards, so that's Grafana, and then administration. Okay, so basically everything else is custom, right? Like Grafana has an alerting solution. We don't use Grafana's alerting solution. We've rolled our own. And so what we've done is pretty much all of Observe is we maintain a Grafana fork, lightly modified. We want to modify it as little as possible so we can stay up to date. The more we diverge, the harder it is to stay up to date. The curse of maintaining forks. But so we tweak the fork itself as little as possible, and then beyond that, we're just leveraging plugins. So pretty much all of our data sources are implemented as data source plugins, and then we're using app plugins, so everything else is basically Grafana app plugins, which is, at the end of the day, it's just React. You're making your own React app, and it's hosted in a div inside of Grafana. So I'm gonna start by looking at the data sources piece of it. So, if you're going to Grafana's Explorer or you're building a dashboard and you want to add a new visualization, this is kind of what it looks like. Data sources, you got metrics, logs, traces, profiles. We also have some other things like BigQuery or Google Sheets. These are things people use commonly at Shopify, right? Like Elijah was saying, a couple of years ago, we had one vendor for each signal. You would go one place to look at your traces, one place to look at your logs. If you wanted to look at them together, open two tabs, copy, paste IDs, jump between the systems. And so, this is really radically different, which is like I can make a dashboard and I can query my metrics and I can query my logs and traces. All of this stuff is here in one place. And all of these are implemented as data source plugins. So just out of the box, Grafana, they're conforming to the API contracts of Grafana so that they can just work in dashboards. Beyond that, I mean, that's kind of it for the dashboards piece. Beyond that, everything else that I'm going to show is pretty much app plugins, or it's our custom pages. And I'm going to start with metrics and monitoring because that was the first really big migration that we did. So a big part of, so metrics and monitoring, metrics list, monitoring. I'm going to start with the metrics list here. A big part of what we saw when we're doing these migrations, going back to that idea of cleaning up data, so much of the problem is visibility. It's like literally what exists. So for us as an observability team, it's like, what are all of these metrics? What is their cardinality? What are we paying for? Like, how do we have visibility into the data, and is it being used? For our users, it's this idea of like, I walk into this observability system, there's a ton of data. What do I actually care about? As a user, what do I want to query? How do I know how to find the metric? How do I know how it's labeled? Those types of things. So, a theme you're going to see through a lot of the work we've done is just making the data much more visible, which is super useful, super powerful to our users when they're trying to build queries, find the data, get to good answers. It's super, super useful for us when we're trying to maintain these systems, keep them cost efficient, and ultimately we want more signal, less noise, right? So the metrics list, it's pretty simple. It's a page, and it's a list of all the metrics in the system. You can type and start filtering down to find the metrics, to search the metrics for what you care about. We got the metric names and just some basic information, type, help text if we have it. Cardinality, this is a big deal. This is something we didn't have good visibility into with our vendors, but we care a lot, especially about Prometheus-based metric system. Cardinality matters a lot to the performance of these metrics, the cost to support them. And so making this kind of information visible to ourselves and to users, very useful. Referenced in, for all of these metrics, we can tell what dashboards are referencing them, what alert rules, what SLOs. That lets us do things like say, hey, what are the really high cardinality metrics that nobody's even using, nobody's looking at? If you click on any one of these metrics, it's going to take you in a metrics details page, has some of the same info at the top, and then some more detailed info, so I can see all of the labels on this metric, a bunch of sample values. I can see pretty much just like a starter query, right? Anybody who's used Prometheus, PromQL, it's kind of a beast. It's really not always so obvious or easy for people to know, like, you gotta rate those counters, you gotta, the incantation for histogram quantile, right? Like the metrics themselves you can't really just use them on their own, you gotta query them correctly. And so this is a pretty simple thing, but we found it really useful, just like, given this metric, what are some like basic simple ways that you would query it? All of these things are searchable and clickable, so if I click some label values, it'll apply it as a filter. If I click a label name, it'll group by. These things are buttons, so I could click and get a list of the dashboards, click that and jump to the dashboard. So like if I'm a user, I might be able to just be like, well, okay, how is someone else querying? Let me see some example queries. How are other people using this metric? That kind of thing. So this is a great place to get started with like finding a metric and understanding just like basically what does it have? Is this the thing I want? How would I query it? And then from there, you're going to go into the query building experience. So we rolled our own custom data source plugin for metrics. Under the hood, it's built on the out-of-the-box Prometheus data source. It is all PromQL for the PromQL lovers out there. You can go in advanced mode and just write your own PromQL. But there's a few reasons that this wasn't really, we couldn't use the out-of-the-box solution. It wasn't good enough. And we felt like we needed to sort of build our own point-and-click builder experience on top of this. One of those things basically came down to what I was saying before, which is the migration process and shifting people from these vendor products, which had quite a good quality query building experience, to PromQL. PromQL feels really hostile to the, it's tough, right? And so we needed to give a better experience that matches just like the actual workflow, which is like, first I choose my metric, then I filter it, then what are the actual things I can do with this metric, right? Group by, you can just like pretty point and click kind of drop downs that sort of thing. The other part that was really important is autocomplete suggestions. This is like such a consistent theme. It goes back to Elijah's point about the scale. So much of what we're doing here, like the scale is the problem, right? If you're running like a really small startup, observability is not that hard, right? Any out-of-the-box tool, Elk Stack or something, right? The problem with this stuff is at really high scale. So even just using the out-of-the-box Prometheus plugin, when it wants to do things like autocomplete suggestions, it wants to give you the list of metrics or the list of labels, it just, the Prometheus data source plugin itself, the Prometheus APIs, even the Thanos APIs, which is supposed to be scaled Prometheus, those things just dump like the full metrics list. They're like, here's like 5 megabytes of millions and millions and millions of metric names, and they just hand that to the browser, right? So if you've used like the normal PromQL editor and you're like, I have autocomplete suggestions, it works fine. It does, because you have like 50 metrics and it's just doing the in-memory filtering. But at our scale, we had to do like a lot of work. There's a lot of engineering work that goes into sort of the metadata side of taking all of our data and trying to condense it down to relatively small data sets to drive autocomplete suggestions at interaction speed, at the speed of a user typing and getting feedback in real time. So that's been a big challenge, but so we got our data source plugin and it works. You get good autocomplete suggestions. This is the experience for building metric queries. This is how it looks in dashboards. This is how it looks on Explore. This is how it looks when you're building an alert rule anywhere in Observe. When you're querying metrics, you get this UX. Okay, which takes us to monitoring. So monitoring, if I look at it in the nav, monitoring is alert rules, SLOs, notification policies, global silences, synthetic checks, and webhooks. That's how it looks on the side nav. If you click on any one of those, you're going to land on this page: alert rules, SLOs, notification policies, global silences, synthetic checks, webhooks. So it's just one page with a bunch of tabs. If you click somewhere, if you click in the nav, you land on that tab. Each page is pretty much just a list of objects. You can search, you can filter, and you can click into the details, or you can create a new object, right? So some things to call out. A lot of what we've done, right? Okay, so you can see any of these, you've got alert rules, they're firing or they're not, they've got a name. They are associated with the Vault team. This is Shopify's internal org structure. We sync in Shopify's org structure, the team structure. We know who users are, right? If you log in, I know who you are. I know what team you're on. I know your team in relation to the org structure. Services DB service. Services DB is Shopify's internal tool for like all of our services. In the previous world of vendors, such a big problem is just like the build up of cruft over time and ownership. You have all these dashboards, all these alerts that somebody made sometime 5 years ago. You don't really understand who owns anything. Maybe you get these like naming conventions with square brackets or whatever. And so throughout Observe, one of the things we really wanted to do is like going back to cleaning up data and thinking about maintaining for the long term, is making sure that these things, like there's a clear sense of ownership that's tied to what teams are these things owned by, what services are they associated with. And so you'll see that throughout the product. And then alert rules have a notification policies that says like, when this alert fires, what should happen? If I click into any alert rule, here's what it looks like. Alert rules have a configuration. This is a pretty simple one. Query, threshold. If it passes that threshold for 15 minutes, the alert's going to fire. Summary and message. This is what's going to show up in those notifications in Slack. You can attach links to dashboards, playbooks, that kind of thing. Service association, team, notification policy. I'm not going to show the edit screen. If you click edit, you'll get a form. You can change all this stuff. We have a lot of alert capabilities. We have like the idea of anomaly alerts, so you can fire alerts if your signal is sort of 2 or 3 standard deviations off of normal. We have no data alerts, so your alert can fire if data stops coming in. We have, in some special cases, we have the ability also to alert, mainly this is based off metrics, but we have the ability to alert off logging in some cases. Right, so I can edit it, I can delete it, silence it, clone it. If I scroll down on the page, I'm going to see this alert history. I see the signal. It's been going into warning, and I can see a history of when that alert has fired. So that's an alert rule. Here's SLOs. SLOs are similar to alerts, right? A large point is to page or notify you, but the model is a little bit different because when you configure, let's see, I'll jump back. So when you configure an SLO, it's a little bit different because instead of taking any arbitrary expression, we try to be a bit more strict. You are going to tell me what is your SLI. We're really thinking about like availability, latency. You can do custom SLIs, but for the most part, we're encouraging you to like really think about it as like, first, tell me the indicator of are you working? This is in this case, it's my expectation is this API returns responses in less than 30 seconds, right? And I expect that to happen 99% of the time. So when I look at an SLO, right, this is going to show, my objective is 90%. I'm not very ambitious here. I could definitely raise that because we're doing pretty good, actually. So you set up your SLI, and then we calculate an error budget for you. So rather than you say, like, here's the threshold, fire if, rather than saying, okay, alert me every time my query is slower than 30 seconds, right, what I'm going to say is my goal is to be faster than 30 seconds, but I understand I'm not perfect all the time. So I want to be faster than 30 seconds 99% of the time. And what the SLO system is going to do, ultimately, it's an implementation of, this is from the Google SRE workbook, multi-window, multi-burn rate alerts. This was really cool. Sam Dufel in particular worked really hard on this. But based on your SLI and your objective, we're going to calculate an error budget, and then we're going to try to intelligently alert you if you are failing to meet your SLO in such a way that you are burning against your error budget in such a way that you're putting your SLO at risk, right? So like, hey, we are failing to serve queries fast enough, and if you don't act now, you're actually going to fail your SLO for the next 30 days. So that's what SLOs kind of looks like, right? We track your success percentage over time, your error budget remaining. You can kind of see your history. SLOs, pretty cool. This whole concept, it's kind of hard to explain. This is a place we really had to support people a lot. We did our best to kind of build this into the product to give people an idea of like, it depends a lot on what your target objective is, right? The difference between 99, 2 nines, 3 nines, 4 nines, that really changes how much error budget you have, and it really changes how aggressively this thing is going to alert you. So we tried to help make that visible or comprehensible within the product, but it's a challenge, and sometimes we just got to sit down and talk to people about it. And then obviously the other really big part of the monitoring experience is what does it look like when you get alerted? I don't have a picture of a page, but I mean, it's pager duty. You get texted, you get called, you get pinged on pager duty. Our Slack alerts are actually really nice. The first version of this, we kind of just built on top of the Prometheus Alert Manager. It was okay, it was certainly functional, but Sam and Andre did a ton of work to really greatly improve this experience so that we get better alerts, embedded graph, the ability to jump or silence straight from the Slack UI, and also threaded responses. That might sound simple, but it was quite annoying. If you had a flapping alert, I mean, it could just, your Slack channel would just get spammed. So threading the alert status was really nice. So we made some really big improvements here to just that actual experience of getting alerted, especially in Slack. And then all of this stuff ties to notification policies. So the idea is I tie an alert or an SLO to a notification policy. We automatically, again, we sync in all of the PagerDuty services, all of the Slack channels. You could also tie an alert to a webhook. If the alert fires, post that data to some URL. This is really nice. In the previous world with vendors, right? There's like quite a bit of rigmarole to set up a new PagerDuty service and wire it up to the vendor. You would have to do it once for the logging vendor and another time for the monitoring vendor, or to pull in a Slack channel. Like there's like a lot of process every time. Now users really don't think about it. This stuff is just automatically synced in on like a 1 minute or a 5 minute interval. If the Slack channel exists, if the PagerDuty service exists, here it is. Let's take a look at synthetic checks. Synthetic checks are pretty dope. Basically, you're setting up a playwright test to run against some URL on some interval from some region, right? Here's one that's running every 10 minutes from the US East region, and it's basically going great. These guys are doing a great job. If the synthetic checks started failing, you would get alerted. You can kind of scroll down and see a history of each run, how long it took. You can click into these, and especially if it failed, you might be interested in pulling out basically the results of the playwright test. So like the spec results, what failed, screenshots, that kind of thing. So we leverage this heavily to do like end-to-end testing. Like we make sure that our merchants' shops are working, that kind of thing. We make sure our public-facing site is working. This is cool. I don't think I have a picture of webhooks, but it's webhook configuration. URL, it'll post. And then the last thing I'm showing here, so this is a team view. So this is really a lot of the same stuff: dashboards, alert rules, SLOs, notification policies, services. But because we have all these objects, right, you can sort of take the same objects and look at them through different lenses. So I can look at a list of all of the alert rules in Shopify, but a lot of times that's not really what I want. I just want to go to my team's page. I really care about the stuff that I own. And so even like right when I log in, Observe knows that I'm Erin. It knows I'm the observability team. And I'm usually just going to drop into the My Team page. All our dashboards, we automatically create folders per team. So every team has their own dedicated folder where their dashboards live. Again, going back to ownership. And so we can take the same data and sort of give it different views. We also have like service views. So I can look at a service and see the alerts that are associated with it, that kind of thing. So ultimately, this is not different information. It's just arranged with a different perspective in mind. You can explore all of the teams at Shopify. So if I'm like, okay, I really want to know what monitoring does the checkout team have, I can just go to the checkout team page, and I'm going to see all the dashboards they use, the alerts and SLOs that they have, that kind of thing. Quite nice. Okay, so that covers it for metrics and monitoring. That's most of the significant product surface area. Now I'm going to talk about Investigate up here. This is our new tool for tracing and logging, basically how we search and analyze this data. So here's okay, yeah. So the navigation piece of it, right? Like Investigate, traces, logs, requests. If I click on any of those, I'm just going to land on this page. There's that drop down there. Traces, logs, requests. So clicking any of those links, it's going to bring you to the same place, and it's just changing what source you're querying, or you can click for yourself. And let's look at what it looks like to search logs or traces. So this is like your most basic thing you can do with Investigate. It's a log search. One moment. It's a log search. So pretty much the experience. Again, we're going back to that builder, point and click, good quality auto complete experience. We've done a lot of work so that when I start building my filters, I'm going to get a list of all the fields that appear in these logs. Some of these log indexes are huge. There might be many millions, once again, many millions of unique field names. So this is all, like, this is driven off materialized views on the data, server-side filtering, and we're going to suggest the field names as you type. Once I select a field name, I will get value suggestions. Again, there can be very many value suggestions, especially with logging and tracing data. We don't necessarily support autocomplete suggestions like this for every single field, but for the most important fields, we do. Once you've built your, as you apply filters, those autocomplete suggestions cascade, right? So here I've filtered to Thanos receivers. Now the subsequent field name suggestions that I'm getting, these are only fields that appear on logs from the Thanos receivers, okay? So this is really helpful for ultimately building correct queries, right? Getting people to real data, right? So again, that doesn't work for every single field, but it does work. Ultimately, it works for like the primary keys that order buys on the data sets, but this is another place where it's like, we own the whole thing end to end. We know the data, we know our query patterns, and we own the product. And so what we can do is say, like, you know, it's not feasible to provide perfect autocomplete suggestions for the cascade and all. Like, the only way you could do that is just actually execute the queries, which is slow. But we can optimize the experience to know that along the main query paths and along the fields that matter, right? It's like at the same time, it's performant and what's most useful, right? It's a value, kind of something we can do because we own the whole thing end to end. Once you execute a query, here's your search results. Results, share button at the top, event volume graph, how many of these events occurred over time, over the last hour, and then a results grid, right? You know, let's see, the data grid, you can do all the data grid stuff. You can filter, sort, rearrange columns, add or remove columns, drag, resize. By default, we've used a data table, but you could just do a list of events if you want. You can download your results. We have this very nice column sidebar on the left, which shows you which, given the results that came back, what are the actual fields that appear on these logs? What's the number of unique values? If you click on one of those, I clicked on message, it's going to show me the top 10 values, how many, right? About 50%, in the logs that came back here, about 50% of them have this error message. You can quick filter, right? So a lot of it is like that. Yeah. You guys are really fucking up. Okay, so you could quick filter to drill down, right? All of these things that ultimately it's just like the goal here is perform the search, get the results, be able to make sense of the data, and then quickly iterate, drill down, modify the query to get to the thing I care about. The other thing, obviously, oh my God, here we go. Okay, so if I'm looking at the results, you also got this little button right here, the brackets. If I click on it, it's just gonna pop open a side drawer. Here's the log itself. I can kind of do arrow keys or click next, next, next to scroll through them that way, but just look at the raw log events this way. Okay, and then one other really cool thing to show that goes back to like we know the data is that for a given data set and for a particular field, we can basically attach like URL patterns. So these are some logs that are coming out of our notification system, our email system. They have like their own tool, the notification platform. And so what we know is like, hey, anytime I'm looking at logs out of our notification system, anytime there's an email ID, we can just turn that into a link, and if you click on this, it's just going to jump you to the notification platform where you can view all the details of that email. It's stuff that wouldn't make sense to put in Observe. It's not really observability data, but it's like, look, I can just jump to another one of our tools. We're tightly integrated with the other parts of Shopify, so I can just jump to look at the email ID or the API client or the shop, that kind of stuff. And that like just works anywhere that you're showing events out of this index. It's just going to kind of be linked like that. Okay. Oh, Everything I was showing is logs. Works the same for traces. At the end of the day, trace spans versus logs, they're just structured events. It's really not any different. So the query experience is the same, and the result viewing is the same, with one difference, which is because these are traces, now there's this other button, trace, and for any given span, I can click on that and pop open a side drawer to view the trace and view the span, this particular span, within the trace. Ooh, okay, where are we at? So now here's where it gets really cool. We have all the signals in one place. So we can do even better. If we have, what we have is basically what we call correlations and correlation views. But if I'm looking at any event, log or trace from any index, and it has that event is tagged with a request ID, okay, there's this little request button. And if I click that request button, this side drawer slides out. Now it looks, is it the trace? But it looks kind of like the trace view I showed a second ago, but it's actually more than the trace view. It's the trace and all the logs, and all of the queries that we're executing against the storage system. This request was associated with a profile, so I could jump to look at the profile. I know where this request was executed on infrastructure, so I can show relevant inframetrics. And I know this thing is a request, and so I can extract I have this header. IDs have been changed to protect the innocent. Okay, but I know this is a request. I know I'm Shopify, so I can extract information like the shop ID, the pod ID. That's our internal sharding strategy. So I can put like this top level context for the like headline things you would care about as a request, and then basically I can pull together all of the observability signals that we have that were tagged with this request ID, so I can get a full picture of what all do we know about this particular request. I'm talking about requests. We can also do this right now. We do it for job ID and trace ID, where we see those. And we can also add it, some of the next things we want to do is like checkout tokens or cart tokens, which at Shopify is a very important correlation identifier. One of our biggest users is support all the time. They're coming from the perspective of, I'm a particular shop, I'm a particular checkout. I want to know what happened for this checkout token. And what's really cool about this is I'm showing it, you can get here from a search and then jump to these correlations. But a lot of times people just have an ID, right? Like maybe I'm a dev and I fire a request through my test store and I get back a request ID, cool, where I replicated some behavior. I broke the thing that's broken, right? So I just can copy that request ID and paste it here, or maybe I'm support and I'm getting a user error report, but anywhere I get one of those identifiers, I can just paste it in. I don't need to know the time range. I don't need to say when it happened, but I just paste in that identifier and it's gonna drop me straight into this correlation view, because what we do is we basically have materialized views under the hood. We watch for these correlation identifiers, and we just build a small table of the time ranges. So given this request ID, I know that it occurred between 1:03 and 1:05, and so then as a user, I don't have to know that information. I can just put in the identifier, and then we can go execute a very performant search to pull all of those signals back across all the data that we have. So this has been really, really powerful, and it's super cool to see it come together. I'm getting there. Analytics. Okay, so we're going to go back to that search, and we're going to say, okay, sure, it's all good to search and find individual events, but what I'm really interested in is understanding an aggregate analysis, right? So maybe I'm looking at the Investigate API and some of the API routes, and I'm like, but I want to know what endpoints are getting called the most, and I want a sense of like P50, 75, 95, 99 duration. I want to group it by endpoint, and I'm interested in, and I want to sort by count, basically which endpoints are getting called the most, right? So I can just do this ad hoc analysis on the fly, the query building side of it, right? We just have a bunch of aggregate operators. You can select an operator, then you can select any compatible field, and you hit go. You get back these nicely formatted query results. This kind of stuff is a really big deal because one of the things that we saw coming out of the metrics migration is the metric system is really limited by cardinality. There's all kind of places where people want to answer these questions where they're grouping by high cardinality stuff. I want to know performance per shop ID. I want to know performance per like Git revision, right? I want to see, did Shopify slow down when I pushed out this particular commit? That kind of stuff. You can't label metrics with that super high cardinality, with those super high cardinality labels, but event data doesn't mind. Give me whatever cardinality you want, and then we can just run this ad hoc analysis and get answers to these types of questions. So it's been a pretty big game changer for us. So, what do these results look like? Okay, so when I run a search, right, we're using Grafana's graphs, but this is not like a dashboard. This is a bespoke view. We're trying to display these results in a way that makes sense. We know what the measurements are. We know what the units are. We can summarize and kind of give you this good experience of like summary. You can click to, so like I can kind of from the graph, or right here, I can click on these series to focus the series that I'm interested in. When I'm looking at series, like another really cool thing that we do at the same time that we're executing and getting back the analytics results, we also go we basically on the side also go execute a search to bring back individual events, exemplars. And so when I'm looking at a graph, right, I can click on the time series and, I can do like focusing and stuff, but I can also view exemplars for this time series or this individual data point. I can also get there if I were to click on this spans tab up there. This is exemplar events. And so what this is doing is it's applying the same search criteria, right, like investigate, API, the API endpoints, but it's also saying like, okay, look, the P50, right? The P50 here is 500 ms. So what I'm going to do is go find spans whose duration is close to that 500 ms duration. So these are good examples of the time series data that you are interested in looking at. Okay, saved queries. I think this is the last major feature. Saved queries and templates is another thing we do with Investigate. We have a concept of saved queries. This is really nice. Going, once again, in the days of previous vendors, you had a lot of knowledge management, dev teams, support teams, etc., right? They have some place, some document, some Vault page, some Google Doc, where they are saying like, here's the searches that we run to debug. All of that stuff is now pushed into the product as saved queries. They're owned by teams. They have a description. You can basically favorite a saved query. This is kind of nice. So you can set any given saved query as your default so that every time you load up to investigate, it's going to load up to a query that makes sense for you personally or for your services that you operate or for your team. So you don't have to like clear and reset the same filters every time. And ultimately, these saved queries can also be templated. This is really nice because we have a lot of internal users of varying levels of technical, either technicality or just knowing the particular service data. And so this basically lets people build templated queries where they can, they can build sort of they can build the sort of more complex actual search or analytics query. They know what fields you need to look at, what filters you always need to apply, and then they can ask the user, they can give them a fairly simple form where it's like, look, just give me the email recipient, I'll figure it out, and I'll go get the search results for you, okay? So I'm gonna stop there. I didn't really cover a bunch of stuff. I didn't cover profiling really. I showed teams briefly. I didn't look at the service views. That's a lot of the same info, just from a different perspective. But and I skipped past a lot of the details, but I think that's a decent tour of the high level. This is the core functionality that makes up Observe as a UI, as a product, and ultimately like the function that we are serving for Shopify. Obviously, the UI is just the tip of the iceberg in a sense. It's what maybe our users interact with the most, but you can make pretty UI all day, but it only works if all of this works, right? And so I think for us, what I would say that's interesting is where we are right now. First of all, it's kind of incredible for me to do this and look at like everything that we've built over the past 3 years. And if anything, being like, I gotta leave that out, I gotta leave that out, I gotta leave that out. It's crazy. It's crazy how much we've built. With a team of this size, we've just worked really, really hard, and I think just engaged really closely with Shopify to build the tools and the product that we need, right, that we need to do observability well. And I think the other thing that's so exciting is like right now we're kind of coming to the tail end of a series of migrations, and migrations are very like you're replacing load-bearing infrastructure. So it's very like you got to build what you have to build to satisfy these core use cases. And a lot of times what that means is like along the way, you see these cool opportunities, these awesome things you could do, these, wins you could pick up, and you kind of just got to be like, okay, well, I got to come back to that later. And so if anything, what's so cool is to look at where we are now and just understand how much more we can do, how much better we can keep getting from here. Because on some level where we're at now is just like the baseline. It's kind of just the minimum, and like we can just keep getting better. And my evidence for that is basically just the rest of the talks today, right? Everybody else is pretty much going to start deep diving into like the implementation of this stuff. And I think what I see in it that's so crazy is just the trajectory, like how much we have improved, right, from the initial like end-to-end working solution to make it twice as good, and then make it twice as good again, and then make it twice as good again. And we know that we can just keep doing that. So it's really, really exciting to look at this team, to look at where we're at, and look at where we're going to be able to go in the next 3 years. So we're psyched, and I'm going to hand it over to someone else.